In the spring of 1939, many of Europe's most experienced statesmen were still trying to convince themselves that another general war could be avoided. The last one had been too terrible, too recent, too well remembered. No rational government, they believed, would willingly choose that road again. Within 6 months, the largest conflict in human history had begun. Before it ended, it would kill more than 60 million people, redraw the map of the world, and force ordinary men and women into choices no one should ever face. This is not only a story of battles and borders, it is the story of how intelligent people, step by step, walked into catastrophe and what it cost to find a way back out. Every decision you are about to see was made by someone who did not know how this story would end. You do. That is what makes it unbearable, and that is exactly why it must be told. This is the story of the Second World War, and it begins with a peace treaty. Chapter 1. The Peace That Failed. On June 28th of 1919, 2 German politicians walked into the most famous room in France. Their names were Hermann Müller and Johannes Bell. Almost no one remembers them today, and that is part of the point. They were not emperors or generals. Müller was a foreign minister who had held the job for barely a week. Bell was a minister of colonies whose colonies had already been taken away. The German government had gone through agonized debates about whether anyone should sign at all, and more than one official had resigned rather than put his name on the document waiting inside. The room was the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The French had chosen it deliberately. 48 years earlier, in that same hall, a newly unified Germany had proclaimed its empire over a defeated France. Now the ceremony would run in reverse. The date was deliberate too. 5 years to the day since an assassination in Sarajevo had set the First World War in motion. Müller and Bell believed they had no real choice. The Allied blockade was still strangling German ports. The Allied armies stood ready to march. Refusing to sign meant, as far as the government in Berlin could tell, the occupation and possible breakup of Germany itself. So they signed. They did not know they were signing a document that an entire political movement would spend the next 20 years holding up as proof of betrayal. They only knew they were ending a war. What did the treaty actually demand? Germany lost roughly 13% of its territory in Europe and every one of its overseas colonies. Its army was capped at 100,000 men, with no air force, no tanks, and almost no navy. The left bank of the Rhine, along with a belt of territory extending 50 kilometers east of the river, was permanently demilitarized, and in a clause numbered 231, Germany was required to accept responsibility for the war as the legal basis for paying reparations. A bill later organized at 132 billion gold marks. Here is where this story usually takes a shortcut, and where we are going to slow down. The familiar version says that Versailles was so cruel that it made the next war inevitable. That version is clean, satisfying, and too simple. Consider what serious historians have found when they went back into the records. The economist John Maynard Keynes attacked the treaty within months in a book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and his picture of a vindictive, impossible settlement shaped opinion across Europe and America. But later scholars, among them the historian Margaret Macmillan in her study of the Peace Conference, have argued that the treaty was less crushing in practice than in reputation. The reparations bill was structured so that a large part of it was never seriously expected to be collected. Germany remained the largest country in Central Europe, its industrial core intact, its potential greater than that of any neighbor. The real damage was not economic, it was the story. Because the war had ended with German armies still standing on foreign soil, because no Allied soldier had marched through Berlin as a conqueror. Millions of Germans found it possible to believe that their army had never truly been defeated at all. It had been betrayed. The story went. Stabbed in the back by politicians at home. The men who signed the armistice and the treaty were branded the November criminals. It was false. The German military leadership itself had demanded an armistice in the autumn of 1918 because the front was collapsing. But the myth did not need to be true. It only needed to be repeated. A peace can create resentment. Resentment becomes catastrophe only when someone chooses to organize it. And for a while, it genuinely looked as if no one would. This is the part of the story that gets skipped most often. And skipping it hides the most important lesson. The German Republic, born after the war, remembered as the Weimar Republic, survived shocks that would have killed most governments. In 1923, after a dispute over reparations led French and Belgian troops to occupy the industrial Ruhr Valley, the German currency dissolved into one of the most famous hyperinflations in history. By that November, prices had reached the point where banknotes were more useful as fuel than as money. Savings that families had built across generations became worthless paper in a matter of months. And yet the Republic did not fall. A new currency was introduced. American loans arrived. Under the Foreign Minister, Gustav Stresemann, Germany negotiated its way back into the community of nations and joined the League of Nations in 1926. Berlin in the late 20s was one of the most creative cities on earth. And, in the national election of 1928, the party of Adolf Hitler, the man this entire story bends toward, won less than 3% of the vote. Less than 3%. 9 years after Versailles. The treaty's loudest enemy was a fringe politician leading a movement most Germans regarded as a failed experiment from the beer halls of Munich. So no, Versailles did not make Hitler inevitable. Something else had to break first. It broke in America. In October of 1929, the New York stock market crashed. And the crash exposed how much of the German recovery had been built on short-term American credit. The loans were called home. German banks buckled. Businesses closed. By the winter of 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were unemployed. About 1 worker in 3. Behind that number were families losing homes, veterans selling matches on street corners, and street battles between private armies of the political extremes. Desperation did what the treaty alone had never done. It made the fringe electable. In the election of July 1932, the Nazi Party took about 37% of the vote, the largest share of any party, though never a majority. And then something happened that should give every modern viewer a chill. In the next election, just 4 months later, the Nazi vote actually fell. The movement was losing momentum. It was running out of money. Hitler's moment appeared to be passing. He was rescued by the people who despised him least and understood him worst. A small circle of conservative politicians and landowners around the aging president, Paul von Hindenburg, decided that Hitler could be useful. They wanted to destroy the Republic's democracy and replace it with something more authoritarian. And they believed the Nazi movement could supply the crowds while they supplied the control. The former Chancellor, Franz von Papen, reportedly assured doubters that within 2 months they would have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he would squeak. On January 30th of 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor of Germany. It was not a seizure of power. It was a handover, performed legally, by men who thought they were the ones doing the using. Within a month, the Parliament building burned, and the government used the fire to suspend civil liberties. Within 2 months, an intimidated Parliament passed an act allowing Hitler to rule by decree. Of the major parties, only the Social Democrats, The party of Hermann Müller, the forgotten man from the Hall of Mirrors, stood up in that final session and voted no. 14 years separated the signature at Versailles from the death of German democracy. Nothing about those years was a straight line. At every fork, real people made real choices. And at the last fork, the men with the most power chose worst. Germany now belonged to a movement that had written down, years earlier, exactly what it intended to do. Across the world, 2 other nations were watching, each with ambitions of its own, and each about to test how much the exhausted democracies would tolerate. The answer, tested first in Africa and Asia, would turn out to be almost everything. Chapter 2. The Dictators' Decade. Just before dawn on March 7th of 1936, German troops began moving into the Rhineland. 19 infantry battalions entered the demilitarized zone that morning, and a token force of about 3 battalions crossed the Rhine itself, into the strip of territory along the French border that the Treaty of Versailles had ordered permanently free of German soldiers. By later accounts, their orders contained a secret that would have astonished the world if anyone had known it. If the French army moved against them in force, the advance units were to withdraw. This was not an invasion. It was a bluff wearing boots, and Hitler had ordered it against the advice of his own generals, who believed France would respond and Germany would be humiliated. Hitler later described the 48 hours that followed as the most nerve-wracking of his life. The account comes from his own circle, so it deserves some caution. But the anxiety was rational. The French army on paper vastly outnumbered the force he had sent. A determined French response might well have forced those battalions to turn back. Whether that humiliation would have brought Hitler down, or merely delayed him, is something no one can know. What we know is what actually happened. Nothing happened. France was between governments. Its commanders overestimated German strength, and its leaders would not march without Britain. Britain would not march at all. A widely repeated remark in London held that the Germans were, after all, only walking into their own back garden, and so the bluff succeeded. The generals who had urged caution were discredited, and Hitler drew a lesson he would apply again and again. The democracies would always find a reason to do nothing. To understand why he was so confident, you have to see what he had been watching for the previous 5 years. Hitler had watched others demonstrate the method before he used it himself. The first demonstration had come from Japan. In September of 1931, officers of Japan's Kwantung Army staged an explosion on a railway line in Manchuria, blamed it on China, and used it as the pretext to seize a region larger than France. The critical detail is that the operation was launched by field officers acting largely on their own, and the civilian government in Tokyo, unable to stop them, ended up defending what it had not ordered. When the League of Nations investigated and refused to recognize the conquest, Japan simply walked out of the League. The world's new machinery for preventing war had met its first real test, and the answer to aggression had been a report. The second demonstration came from Italy. Benito Mussolini had ruled there since 1922, the senior dictator of Europe. And by the mid-30s, he wanted an empire to prove that fascism could restore Roman greatness. In October of 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa. This time the League did act, voting sanctions against Italy. But the sanctions left out oil, the one import that could have stopped the campaign. And the Suez Canal stayed open to Italian troop ships. Ethiopian soldiers, some armed with rifles older than their commanders, faced aircraft and poison gas. Their emperor, Haile Selassie, came to Geneva in June of 1936 and warned the assembled delegates that international morality was at stake. and that what happened to his small nation would happen to others. Delegates listened politely. The sanctions were soon lifted. The conquest stood. So by the time those German battalions moved into the Rhineland, the pattern was already visible to anyone willing to see it. Aggression was cheap. The League was a debating society, and the powers that had written the peace were not prepared to defend it. The dictators now began finding each other. In July of 1936, a group of Spanish generals rose against their country's elected republic, and Spain collapsed into civil war. Hitler and Mussolini sent aircraft, tanks, and men to the rebel general, Francisco Franco. The Soviet Union sent advisors and equipment to the Republic. Britain and France chose official non-intervention. For 3 years, Spain became a laboratory where German pilots practiced the coordination of air power and ground attack. In April of 1937, German and Italian aircraft bombed the Basque town of Guernica, and the image of a town destroyed from the air, fixed forever by Pablo Picasso's painting, gave Europe a preview of what modern war would mean for civilians. It fed a fear of bombing that would soon shape the choices of every democratic leader. That same year, the alignments hardened into names. Mussolini spoke of an axis running between Rome and Berlin, and Germany and Japan signed a pact directed against international communism, which Italy soon joined. 3 restless powers, on 3 continents, had begun to move in loose formation. Meanwhile, Germany itself was transforming. Rearmament, at first secret, and then open, put men back to work and put the treaty in the shredder. Conscription returned in 1935. A new air force appeared. In Nuremberg that same year, new laws stripped German Jews of citizenship and criminalized marriage between Jews and other Germans, turning persecution that had begun with boycotts and dismissals in 1933 into the formal architecture of the state. This thread runs beneath every chapter that follows, and it ends in a place that this decade was already quietly preparing. And in July of 1937, at a bridge outside Beijing, a woman's skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops escalated, this time deliberately, into full-scale invasion. The war that would eventually be called the Second World War had, by many measures, already begun in Asia. Shanghai burned that autumn. In December, Japanese forces entered the Chinese capital of Nanjing, and what they did to its people over the following weeks became one of the great atrocities of the 20th century. We will return to China's war at length when this story becomes fully global. For now, hold the picture as 1937 ends. Ethiopia conquered, Spain burning, China invaded, the Rhineland fortified, and in London and Paris, governments still telling themselves that each concession was the last one that would be asked. One man was about to test that belief to destruction, and the test would carry the name of a city in Bavaria. Chapter 3. The Price of Appeasement. On September 15th of 1938, a 69-year-old man boarded an airplane for the first time in his life. He was Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he was flying to meet Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat above Berchtesgaden. Europe stood days from war over Czechoslovakia, and Chamberlain had decided, without consulting his cabinet in advance, that he would go to Hitler personally and negotiate. He saw himself as a practical man of business, doing what practical men do, meeting the other party face to face. He wrote privately that despite the hardness he saw in Hitler's face, he believed this was a man whose word, once given, could be relied on. Hold that sentence in your mind for the next few minutes. It would become one of the most consequential misjudgments of character in modern diplomacy. But before we judge the man who made it, we owe him what history owes everyone: the view from inside his moment, without the ending attached. Chamberlain had been a grown man when his cousin died in the First World War, a war that had killed or wounded more than 2 million men from Britain and its empire. Nearly every adult he governed had lost someone. His military advisors told him that Britain's rearmament was years from maturing and its air defences were still incomplete. The radar chain and the fighter squadrons, both unfinished. Experts predicted that bombing would flatten London in weeks. The Empire's dominions were reluctant to fight over Central Europe. America was locked in neutrality laws. The Soviet Union was untrusted and untested. And the object of the crisis, the Sudetenland, was a border region of Czechoslovakia inhabited mostly by ethnic Germans, which allowed Hitler to dress conquest in the clothing of self-determination, the very principle the democracies claimed to honor. None of that had begun in September. 6 months earlier, in March of 1938, German troops had rolled into Austria, and Hitler had annexed the country of his birth to cheering crowds in Vienna. Crowds that were real, and terror for Vienna's Jews that began the same week, which was also real. Britain and France protested and accepted. Czechoslovakia, a democracy with a serious army, modern border, fortifications, and alliances with France, was the obvious next target, and everyone knew it. Through the summer, Hitler manufactured the crisis, instructing Sudeten German leaders to keep raising demands that could never be satisfied. By September, Europe's newspapers were printing air raid instructions. Trenches were dug in London parks. Gas masks were issued to children. This is the world in which Chamberlain got on the plane. He flew to Germany 3 times in 2 weeks. At the first meeting, Hitler stated his terms. At the second, at Bad Godesberg, Hitler raised them, demanding immediate military occupation. And even Chamberlain balked. War looked certain. Then, with Mussolini acting as broker, a final conference was called at Munich on September 29th. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met through the night and agreed that Germany would take the Sudetenland in stages, beginning 2 days later. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the table. Its representatives waited in a hotel room to be told what had been decided about their country. Nor was the Soviet Union invited, a slight that Stalin filed away carefully. Chamberlain flew home to scenes of joy that are difficult to believe today. Crowds filled Downing Street. He appeared at a window and spoke of peace with honor. And peace for our time. Roosevelt cabled him 2 words. Good man. It is easy to forget, and dishonest to hide, that in that moment Munich was wildly popular. Millions of ordinary people across Europe believed a world war had just been prevented, because for a few days it had been. In the House of Commons, one voice cut against the mood. Winston Churchill, out of office and widely distrusted, told the chamber that Britain and France had sustained a total and unmitigated defeat, and that this was only the beginning of the reckoning. He was shouted down by members of his own party. Within 6 weeks, the reckoning began arriving on schedule. In November, across Germany and annexed Austria, the regime unleashed an organized night of violence against its Jewish citizens. Synagogues burned while fire brigades stood by to protect neighboring buildings. Shop windows were smashed by the ton, giving the pogrom its bitter name, the Night of Broken Glass. About 30,000 Jewish men were arrested into concentration camps. Whatever Munich had purchased, it was not the appetite of the regime growing milder. Then, in March of 1939, German troops occupied Prague and the rest of the Czech lands. No referendum, no German minority to liberate, no pretense of self-determination, just conquest. And with Prague, something snapped in British opinion. The argument that Hitler only wanted to gather Germans into one state was dead. Killed by Hitler himself. Within weeks, Britain issued a formal guarantee to the next obvious target. Poland. The policy of appeasement was over, replaced by a line drawn in public. Historians have argued about Chamberlain ever since, and honest viewers should know the debate is real. Some, like R.A.C. Parker, and more recently Tim Bouverie, have concluded that alternatives existed and chances to resist were missed. That Munich abandoned a democracy with a real army and bought Hitler a year he used better than the Allies used it. Others emphasize the constraints, the unready air defenses, the divided empire, the genuine horror of another war. And note that the year also allowed Britain's fighter production and radar chain to mature. Where nearly everyone agrees is on the outcome. Munich sacrificed Czechoslovakia, strengthened Hitler's position and his contempt for the democracies, and failed on its own terms. Because the word Munich itself became a permanent synonym for surrender. The final blow of the decade came from the direction no one predicted. Through the summer of 1939, Britain and France conducted slow, half-hearted talks with the Soviet Union about containing Germany. Stalin, excluded at Munich and deeply suspicious that the West hoped to point Hitler eastward, was listening to other offers. On August 23rd, German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop flew to Moscow, and by morning, the impossible was signed. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, ideological blood enemies whose propaganda had spent years promising to destroy each other, had concluded a non-aggression pact. Attached to it was a secret protocol, denied by Moscow for half a century, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres, with Poland split between them. In London and Paris, the news landed like a physical blow. In Tokyo, which had been fighting Soviet troops in border battles that very month, it felt like betrayal by Berlin. And in the German army's planning offices, one of the last restraints on Hitler's immediate timetable was gone. He now believed, with better evidence than at Munich, that Britain and France would once again find a reason to do nothing. On September 1st of 1939, he acted on that belief. This time, he was wrong, and tens of millions of people would die inside the proof. Chapter 4. Blitzkrieg. On the evening of August 31st of 1939, a small group of SS men, dressed in Polish uniforms, seized a German radio station near the border town of Gleiwitz. They broadcast a short message in Polish, fired shots into the air, and left behind a body dressed to look like a casualty of the raid. The operation was led, according to his own sworn account, years later at Nuremberg, by an SS officer named Alfred Naujoks. It was one of several staged incidents along the frontier that night. Manufactured evidence for a claim the world was supposed to believe the next morning, that Poland had attacked Germany. Almost no one believed it. It did not matter. The decision this pretext was built to justify had already been made. At dawn, on September 1st, more than 1.5 million German troops crossed the Polish border, and the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, moored in Danzig harbour on a friendship visit, opened fire on a Polish garrison at point-blank range. 2 days later, Britain and France honoured their guarantee and declared war on Germany. Hitler had gambled one more time that they would find a reason to do nothing, and this time he had lost the bet. But the declaration did almost nothing for Poland. No French offensive of any weight crossed the German frontier. No British bombers flattened German industry. Poland fought alone, and it fought better than the propaganda of its enemies ever admitted. You may have heard the story of Polish cavalry charging German tanks with lances. It is worth stopping on, because it shows how myths get made. At Casualty, on the first day of the war, Polish cavalry successfully charged a German infantry unit in the open, then withdrew when armored vehicles arrived. Italian journalists, shown the aftermath, were encouraged to report that the horsemen had charged the tanks themselves. And both German and later Soviet propaganda kept the story alive, because a nation of romantic fools suited both of them. The reality is that Poland was defeated by geography and numbers, attacked along a border it could not hope to hold, by an enemy with roughly double its forces and total command of the air. Warsaw itself was bombed from the first day of the war, and held out under siege until late September. Then, on September 17th, the second blow fell, the one the secret protocol had arranged. The Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, caught between two armies. The Polish state was extinguished by early October, and its territory divided between the two powers that had shaken hands in Moscow 6 weeks earlier. Poland's government escaped into exile, and its soldiers began the long journey west by every route imaginable. Remember them. Tens of thousands of them will reappear in this story, flying over London and bleeding on an Italian mountainside. What followed in the West was so strange that people at the time gave it mocking names. The Phony War, the Sitting War. For 7 months, the great armies of France and Germany faced each other and barely fired. Britain shipped an expeditionary force to France. Children were evacuated from London in anticipation of bombing that did not come. Some began to hope the war might simply expire. The war was not expiring. It was moving. That winter, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, expecting a quick victory, and instead received a humiliation. For over 3 months, Finnish ski troops carved up Soviet columns in frozen forests, and the world watched a small democracy embarrass a giant. Finland was forced in the end to give up territory. But the performance of the Red Army planted an idea in German minds that would matter enormously later. The idea that the Soviet colossus was rotten and would collapse if kicked. Then, in April of 1940, Hitler struck north. Denmark was overrun in hours. Norway, invaded by sea and air, fought on with British and French help into June. But the campaign ended in Allied evacuation and the fall of the government in London that had managed it. The failure in Norway destroyed Neville Chamberlain's premiership, and on May 10th of 1940, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. He took office on the worst possible morning, because at dawn that same day, the German offensive in the West began. Here is the question this chapter exists to answer. France had what was widely considered the strongest army in Europe, together with Britain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Allies matched the Germans in men, and in tanks they had more, and many of them better. Yet, in 6 weeks, the whole position collapsed. Why? Not because of a magic word. The word Blitzkrieg explains less than it seems to. The real answer is a chain of choices on both sides. The German plan was itself a product of accident and argument. The original scheme had been a repeat of the First World War, a swing through Belgium, and the Allies expected exactly that. Then, in January of 1940, a German courier plane carrying parts of the planned crash landed in Belgium. The crash reinforced pressure in Berlin to reconsider, though historians disagree about how decisive it was. And in the end, Hitler embraced a radical alternative, pressed by a general named Erich von Manstein. The main armoured weight would go not through central Belgium, but through the Ardennes, a hilly, the forested region the French High Command judged unsuitable for tanks, and therefore left thinly guarded, directly in front of the weakest stretch of their line near Sedan. When the attack came, the Allies did what the Germans hoped they would do. Their best armies wheeled north into Belgium to meet what they believed was the main blow. It was a fight. Behind them, the largest concentration of armor yet seen in war ground, through the Ardennes in a traffic jam over 100 miles long. A column so vulnerable that historians have argued ever since about what determined air attack might have done to it. It was barely touched. On May 13th, the Germans crossed the Meuse River at Sedan, and through the gap poured 7 armored divisions, turning not toward Paris but toward the sea, aiming to trap the Allied armies in Belgium from behind. Speed did the rest. German commanders led from the front and made decisions in hours. French headquarters, built for a slower war, took days. Orders arrived describing situations that no longer existed. By May 20th, German tanks reached the Channel coast, the best of the French army, the entire British force, and the Belgians were caught in a shrinking pocket with the sea at their backs. Then came one of the war's enduring puzzles. On May 24th, with the trap almost closed, the German armor was ordered to halt for over 2 days. The reasons are still debated. Worn-out machines, nervous generals wanting to protect the flanks, Goering promising his air force could finish the pocket alone. Whatever the weight of each motive, the pause was a gift, and the British used it. From the harbour and beaches of Dunkirk, in an improvised fleet of destroyers, ferries, fishing boats, and private yachts, over 330,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated to England. Their heavy equipment was left on the sand. It was, as Churchill himself warned his country, a deliverance, but not a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. France fought on for 3 more weeks, and this deserves saying plainly, because the sneering caricature of French surrender is one of the laziest myths of the 20th century. In 6 weeks of 1940, defending their country, somewhere between 50 and 90,000 French soldiers died. By modern estimates, a rate of loss in that short span comparable to the terrible periods of the First World War. On June 10th, with the outcome no longer in doubt, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain, arriving for the spoils. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris, which had been declared an open city to spare it destruction. And on June 22nd, France signed an armistice, in the same railway carriage, hauled out of its museum on Hitler's orders, in which Germany had signed its surrender in 1918. France was broken in 2. The north and the Atlantic coast under German occupation, the south under a new French government at the town of Vichy, led by the aged First World War hero Philippe Pétain, a government that would choose collaboration and stain its name permanently. And in London, a nearly unknown French general named Charles de Gaulle broadcast an appeal declaring that France had lost a battle but not the war. In Berlin, they were dancing in the streets. In 10 months, Hitler had conquered 6 countries. Every rational calculation said Britain, alone at the edge of a hostile continent, would now come to terms. The rational calculation was about to fail, and it failed in a smoke-filled room in London, 3 days before Dunkirk even began. Chapter 5. Britain refused to fall. On May 28th of 1940, in a cramped room in Westminster, Britain's 5-man war cabinet, joined by a handful of other ministers and officials, held the future of the war in its hands, and most of the world had no idea the meeting was happening. The cabinet had been arguing for 3 days. The question on the table, pressed by the Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, was whether Britain should explore what terms Mussolini might broker with Hitler. Not surrender, Halifax insisted, merely an inquiry. France was collapsing. The army was trapped at Dunkirk, and no one yet knew how many men could be saved. Estimates in those first days ran as low as 40 or 50,000. Asking about terms, in that light, was not cowardice. It was arguably the responsible option. And Halifax was a serious man making a serious case. Churchill, Prime Minister for 18 days, distrusted by much of his own party, believed that the inquiry itself would be fatal. Once a government starts asking the price of peace, he argued, its will to fight dissolves and cannot be reassembled. That afternoon, he widened the discussion to the full cabinet of some 25 ministers and put the choice before them starkly, reportedly telling them that if this island story of theirs was to end at last, it should end only when each of them lay choking on the ground. The room erupted in support. Ministers shouted. Some pounded the table. Several pressed forward to grip his hand. The inquiry was dead. Britain would fight on. No cameras recorded it. No newspaper reported it. But many historians regard those 3 days in May as one of the true hinges of the 20th century. Because every later chapter of this story, including the American chapters, depended on Britain still being in the war. Now, a necessary honesty about the word alone. Britain, in the summer of 1940, was alone in one exact sense. No great power stood beside it against Germany. But the fight was never Britain's only. Canada had declared war in September of 1939 by vote of its own parliament. Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa were in. India, brought in by proclamation, would raise what became the largest volunteer army in history. Over 2 million men, exiled Poles, Czechs, Norwegians, Free French, Belgians, and Dutch fought under British command. When you hear alone in this story, hear it as Europe's last unconquered great power, standing at the head of an empire and a collection of exiles, with an ocean between itself and the only other democracies that could eventually tip the scales. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate. He waited weeks, made a public peace overture in July, and was refused. What followed was something new in history. The first campaign ever fought entirely in the air, to decide whether an invasion could even be attempted. The German Air Force outnumbered British Fighter Command, and its pilots were veterans of Spain, Poland, and France. But the defense had advantages that did not show up in raw counts. A chain of radar stations along the coast, primitive by later standards, but revolutionary in 1940, fed sightings into a central control system that let commanders send fighters exactly where they were needed, instead of wasting them on patrols. British factories, under the pressure of Lord Beaverbrook's production drive, were building fighters faster than Germany was. Battles happened over home ground. So, a British pilot who bailed out could fight again the next day, while a German pilot who bailed out became a prisoner. And nearly 1 in 5 of the pilots of Fighter Command was not British at all. They came from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland, and a handful from the still neutral United States. The Polish squadron numbered 303 became one of the highest-scoring units of the entire battle, flown by men with 2 defeats to avenge. Through August, the Germans hammered the radar stations and the fighter airfields, and Fighter Command bent under the strain. Then, in early September, the German effort shifted to bombing London. Historians still weigh the reasons. Retaliation for a British raid on Berlin. Frustration with Fighter Command's refusal to die. A belief that attacking the capital would force the last British fighters into a decisive battle. The shift reduced some of the pressure on the key fighter bases, though attacks on them did not end entirely. And historians dispute how close Fighter Command truly was to collapse. What is certain is the price the city paid. And what happened next in the air? On September 15th, Fighter Command met massed daylight raids over London and broke them. 2 days later, Hitler postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. It was never seriously revived. The bombing did not stop. It moved to the night. From September of 1940 to May of 1941, German bombers raided London and the industrial cities. Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Glasgow, Belfast. In what the British called the Blitz, around 43,000 British civilians were killed. Families slept in subway stations. A photograph of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, standing above an ocean of smoke, became the image of the year. Among the aims of the campaign were the destruction of factories and ports and the breaking of civilian morale. And its central lesson, one that Allied air commanders would later resist applying to their own campaigns, was that the morale did not break. Yet the deadliest threat to Britain was not in the sky. It was under the Atlantic. Britain imported most of its food and all of its oil. And German submarines, the U-boats, now operating from bases on the French coast, were sinking merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Churchill wrote after the war that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him. Against that peril, Britain was building a weapon that would not appear in any newspaper for 30 years. In a country house at Bletchley Park, north of London, a growing staff of mathematicians, linguists, chess, champions, and crossword solvers was attacking the German cipher machines, building on work smuggled out of Poland before the invasion. Their product, distributed to a handful of commanders under the code name Ultra, could not win a battle by itself. What it could do was tell a convoy where the submarines were waiting. And in time, it would do a great deal more than that. Keep the name in mind. It will surface again in a desert. And again, in mid-ocean. The Atlantic Battle, the longest continuous campaign of the entire war, will run beneath the next several chapters like a dark current. And in the spring of 1941, it was being lost. Which brings this story, at last, fully to America. The United States, in 1940, was determined to stay out. The memory of the First World War, and a widespread belief that arms makers and bankers had dragged the country into it, had produced strict neutrality laws. The America First movement, whose most famous voice was the aviator Charles Lindbergh, drew huge crowds arguing that this was Europe's quarrel. President Franklin D. Roosevelt believed that a Nazi-dominated Europe would be a catastrophe for American security. And he also believed he could not move faster than his voters. So he moved sideways, step by step, 50 aging destroyers to Britain in exchange for bases, the first peacetime draft in American history. And in the election of 1940, running for an unprecedented third term, he promised American parents that their boys were not going to be sent into any foreign wars. Then, in December of 1940, Britain's ambassador delivered the blunt truth. Britain was running out of money to pay for American weapons. Roosevelt's answer, unveiled at a press conference with a homely parable about lending your garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire, became the Lend-Lease Act. Signed in March of 1941, America would supply Britain, and later others, with the tools of war, payment deferred to a hazy future. In a radio address, Roosevelt gave the policy its name for history, declaring that America must be the great arsenal of democracy. Isolationists called it the path to war. They were not entirely wrong. By autumn, American warships escorting convoys were in an undeclared shooting war with U-boats in the North Atlantic. And American and British planners were already quietly conferring about strategy in a war America had not joined. Britain had survived. That is the achievement of 1940. and it should not be inflated into more. Britain could not liberate a single acre of occupied Europe. Survival meant the war would continue, not that it would be won. Hitler understood this perfectly, and he drew from it a conclusion of pure ideology dressed as strategy. Britain, he told his generals, was holding on only in hope of Russia. Break Russia, and Britain's last hope dies. His generals had heard him say for 20 years what he truly wanted in the East: land, resources, and the destruction of what he called Jewish Bolshevism. Now, the two motives fused into one order. In December of 1940, while London burned at night and American factories tooled up, the German High Command issued Directive 21. Its code name honored a medieval emperor who, legend said, would one day wake and restore German greatness. They called it Barbarossa. Chapter 6. War of Annihilation. Late on the night of June 21st of 1941, a German soldier slipped away from his unit, crossed the river Bug, and surrendered to Soviet border guards. His name was Alfred Lyskov, and he had come to deliver a warning. The German army, he said, would attack at dawn. His message was rushed up the chain of command to Moscow, where it joined a long accumulation of warnings that had been building for months. British intelligence had warned. American diplomats had warned. A Soviet spy in Tokyo named Richard Sorge had sent detailed reports. Joseph Stalin did not believe them. He had made his decision. And the decision was that the warnings were a trap, a British trick to drag him into war, or a German provocation designed to justify one. He was certain Hitler would never open a second front while Britain remained unbeaten, because that would be irrational. So orders went out that night. But they were cautious, confused, and late. Some accounts say Stalin suspected the deserter was a plant and wanted him treated as one. Across the border, 3 million men were moving into their final positions. At around 3:15 the next morning, along a front of nearly 1,000 miles, the largest invasion in the history of the world began. The scale is genuinely hard to hold in the mind. Over 3 million German troops, supported from the first days by Romanian and Slovak forces, and joined within days and weeks by Finland, Hungary, and later Italy, with more than 3,000 tanks and over 2,000 aircraft, struck a Soviet military caught in the middle of reorganization. Its forward airfields packed with planes, parked wingtip to wingtip. Much of the Soviet Air Force in the West was destroyed in the first days, a large share of it on the ground. Whole Soviet armies were encircled at Minsk, then at Smolensk. In September, an encirclement at Kiev captured over 600,000 men, one of the largest single defeats any army has ever suffered. German officers wrote home that the war would be over by autumn. In Washington and London, many experts privately gave the Soviet Union 6 weeks. But this chapter is not called Barbarossa. It is called War of Annihilation. And the reason lives in the orders the invasion carried with it. This was not a war like the war in France, fought for position and surrender. The German army entered the Soviet Union under written directives that set aside the rules of war. The so-called Commissar Order instructed troops to shoot captured Soviet political officers. Guidelines relieved soldiers of legal responsibility for actions against civilians. Planning documents that survive from the spring of 1941, prepared by economic staffs in Berlin, calmly discussed feeding the German army from Soviet land in the knowledge that this would mean starvation for millions of Soviet civilians. Historians write about these documents under the name the Hunger Plan. It was not a plan that was hidden from the leadership. It was the leadership's plan. And behind the front lines came 4 motorized task groups with a special assignment. The Einsatzgruppen. Their mission: together with police battalions and local collaborators, was mass shooting, Jews above all, along with communist officials, Roma, and anyone defined as a threat, village by village, town by town. Through the summer and autumn of 1941, they worked their way across the occupied East. At the end of September, outside Kyiv, at a ravine called Babi Yar, they shot more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children in 2 days. We know the number because the killers counted, and their reports survive. The thread that began with boycotts and citizenship laws has now become murder on a vast scale. Before any camp you have heard of was operating as a killing center, we will gather this entire story in its own chapter, because it deserves nothing less. Soviet prisoners of war met a fate that is one of the least known atrocities of the entire war. Of roughly 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany during the war, around 3.3 million died in captivity. By the estimates of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and leading scholars, most of them starved, marched to death, or left to die of disease in open-air enclosures in that first winter. In Western Europe, a captured soldier could usually expect to live. In the East, captivity was, for most, a slower way to die. Why, then, did the Soviet Union not collapse the way the experts predicted? Part of the answer is space and numbers. Germany planned to destroy the Red Army near the border, and it did destroy the army it found there. Then the Soviet Union raised new armies, and the map kept offering another 100 miles. Part of the answer is production. In one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the century, Soviet authorities dismantled over 1,500 industrial plants, loaded them onto trains, machines, workers, families and all, and rebuilt them beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach. Hold that image of factories on flat cars. Wars of this size are won in workshops as much as on battlefields, and we will walk those workshops soon. And part of the answer is what the War of Annihilation did to Soviet choices. German occupation policy told Soviet soldiers and civilians, in actions clearer than any propaganda, that surrender meant death anyway. People who might have greeted the end of Stalin's terror. And in parts of Ukraine and the Baltic states, some initially greeted the Germans as liberators from it, learned quickly what the new order actually was. The regime that had starved and purged its own people now wrapped itself in the defense of the motherland. And the war became, for million, simply about survival. By September, Leningrad, the second city of the Soviet Union, was cut off by German and Finnish lines. Hitler's directive was not to storm it, but to seal it and let it starve. The siege that began that autumn would last nearly 900 days, and civilian deaths within the city, mostly from hunger and cold, are estimated at around 1 million, with some estimates higher. In the first winter, rations for many fell to a few slices of bread bulked out with cellulose and other substitutes. People ate wallpaper paste and boiled leather, and the city did not surrender. In October, Germany launched what was meant to be the final act. Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow. Panic touched the capital in mid-October. Ministries burned files, and part of the government evacuated east. Stalin made a decision of his own, and its importance is hard to overstate. He stayed. On November 7th, the anniversary of the revolution, he held the annual military parade in Red Square, and the troops marched past the reviewing stand and continued directly to the front line, some 30 miles away. Then the weather that had slowed the Germans with mud turned to deep cold, for which the German army, promised victory by autumn, had barely prepared, and the intelligence Stalin had once dismissed now paid its debt. Soldiers' reports from Tokyo, indicating that Japan intended to strike south against the Western powers rather than north into Siberia, were among the evidence that allowed Soviet commanders to transfer additional formations from the Far East. Fresh divisions, trained and equipped for winter. On December 5th of 1941, they attacked in front of Moscow, and for the first time in the war, a major German strategic offensive was not merely stopped, but driven back on a broad front. The men who had planned to be home by Christmas dug into frozen ground. The war in the East had become what its own architects had made inevitable: a fight to the death between two systems, on a scale no war had ever reached. And 2 days after that counterblow began, on the other side of the planet, sailors in a peacetime harbor woke to a quiet Sunday morning. Chapter 7. The War Becomes Global. On September 6th of 1941, the leaders of Japan gathered in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo for a conference in the presence of the Emperor. The document before them stated that if diplomacy with the United States did not succeed by roughly early October, Japan would decide for war. The Emperor, Hirohito, was expected to remain silent at such meetings. Instead, he did something unusual. He read aloud a short poem written by his grandfather, the Emperor Meiji, which asked why the winds and waves of strife disturbed a world in which all men were brothers. The room understood it as a rebuke, a signal of unease from the throne. The ministers bowed, and the policy was adopted anyway. To understand how Japan reached that room, you cannot start at the oil embargo, and you certainly cannot start at Pearl Harbor. You have to start where we left the story in Chapter 2, in China, because China is the war the rest of the Pacific War grew out of. And it is the part of this entire story that Western audiences know least. After seizing Manchuria in 1931, Japan drifted deeper under a government it barely controlled, with field armies making policy and assassinating ministers who resisted. In July of 1937, the skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing became a full invasion. Shanghai fell after a battle that cost both sides enormously. And in December of 1937, the Japanese army entered the capital, Nanjing, over the following 6 weeks. Its soldiers killed prisoners and civilians on a scale that shocked even German diplomats on the scene, and committed rape on a scale that gave the atrocity its enduring name. The post-war tribunal in Tokyo put the dead at over 200,000. Chinese official figures place it at 300,000. Some scholars argue for lower ranges. The precise number will never be settled. But the nature of the event is not seriously disputed by mainstream historians anywhere outside apologist circles. China did not surrender. The government of Chiang Kai-shek traded space for time, moving its capital far up the Yangtze River to Chongqing, which then endured years of bombing, some of the heaviest inflicted on any city up to that point. Chinese communist forces under Mao Zedong fought their own campaign, menaced the north while maneuvering against their nominal ally, Chiang. By 1941, Japan had been at war in China for 4 years, held the coast and the great cities, and could not win. Well over 500,000 Japanese troops were tied down there, and they would remain tied down, fighting the majority of Japan's ground war, until the very end. When Americans later asked why Japan could not reinforce its Pacific islands more heavily, a large part of the answer was always China. The war in China is also what set Japan and America on their collision course. Japan imported the lifeblood of a modern military, above all, oil, and it imported most of that oil from the United States. As Japanese forces pushed into northern French Indochina in 1940, Washington began restricting exports. In July of 1941, when Japan occupied the rest of Indochina, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets, and the freeze hardened in practice into a complete cut-off of oil. Japan's planners now stared at a clock. The Navy was burning stockpiled fuel with no replacement. Within perhaps 2 years, the fleet would be unable to sail. Inside the Japanese government, the debate was real and bitter, and it is worth stating fairly. One camp argued for withdrawal from Indochina and some settlement over China to restore trade. But withdrawal from China, after 4 years of sacrifice, was politically unthinkable to the army. A national humiliation. No cabinet believed it could survive. The other path led south, to the oil of the Dutch East Indies and the resources of Southeast Asia. Seizing them meant war with Britain and the Netherlands, and almost certainly with America, whose fleet at Hawaii and whose bases in the Philippines sat across the flank of any southern advance. The Navy's commander, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had studied at Harvard and served in Washington. He is widely reported to have warned his government that against the United States he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but that he had no confidence about what followed. Yet it was Yamamoto who designed the opening blow, on the logic that if war was coming regardless, Japan's only chance was to cripple the American fleet at the outset and win a position so strong that Washington would prefer to negotiate. In October, the government of Prince Konoe fell, and the army minister, General Hideki Toyo, became prime minister. In early November, another imperial conference confirmed the decision. Diplomacy until the deadline, and then war. On November 26th, a Japanese fleet built around 6 aircraft carriers left its anchorage in the remote Kuril Islands and disappeared into the empty North Pacific, maintaining radio silence, refueling in heavy seas, following a route chosen because no shipping lanes crossed it. At 7:55 on the morning of Sunday, December 7th of 1941, the first wave arrived over Pearl Harbor. The attack lasted about 2 hours. 8 American battleships were sunk or damaged, along with most of the other warships in the harbor, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. 2,403 Americans were killed. Nearly half of them died on one ship, the battleship Arizona, which exploded when a bomb reached a forward magazine, and which lies where it sank today, a national memorial above which the flag is raised and lowered daily. Tactically, the strike was a stunning success. Strategically, it contained the seeds of its own failure, and you should know both halves. The 3 American aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the ships that would decide the coming war, were at sea that morning and untouched. The vast oil storage tanks and repair yards were barely hit, which meant Pearl Harbor remained a working base. And the manner of the attack, delivered while Japanese envoys were still formally at peace in Washington, because the final diplomatic note was decoded and delivered late. Produced in America, not the demoralization Tokyo hoped for, but a unifying fury. The America First movement dissolved almost overnight. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress, naming December 7th a date which will live in infamy. And the vote for war had a single dissenter. Pearl Harbor was only one blow in a coordinated offensive that spanned a quarter of the globe in its first hours. Japanese troops landed in British Malaya even before the first bombs fell in Hawaii. Hong Kong was attacked. Guam and Wake Island were attacked. American air power in the Philippines was caught and largely destroyed on the ground, hours after news of Pearl Harbor had arrived. A failure still argued about. Within weeks, 2 of Britain's most powerful warships were sunk from the air off Malaya, and the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore was under siege. It would surrender in February. In what Churchill called the the worst disaster in British military history. With around 80,000 troops, British, Indian, and Australian, marching into a captivity of terrible cruelty. One decision remained to make the war truly a world war, and it was not made in Tokyo or Washington. Germany had no treaty obligation to join Japan's war of aggression. Yet, on December 11th, Hitler declared war on the United States, relieving Roosevelt of the difficult task of persuading Americans to fight Germany first. Historians still debate his reasoning: contempt for American power, the reality of the undeclared naval war already underway in the Atlantic, the hope that Japan would repay the favor against the Soviet Union. Whatever the mixture, it may rank among the least necessary declarations of war ever issued. And it sealed the shape of everything that followed. In London, Churchill later wrote that on hearing of Pearl Harbor, he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful, because he believed that with America in, the end was certain, however long the road. In December of 1941, that certainty was an act of faith. Japan's advance had months of victories still ahead of it. The U-boats were about to feast along an unprepared American coast, and the largest armies on Earth were locked together in the snow before Moscow. The world was now one war. 1942 would decide which way it tipped. Chapter 8. The year the Axis stopped winning. In the last week of May of 1942, in a basement office at Pearl Harbor, an admiral had to decide whether to bet the entire Pacific War on a group of codebreakers. The admiral was Chester Nimitz, commander of a fleet still scarred from December. The codebreakers, working in a windowless room they called the dungeon, believed they had partially cracked the Japanese naval code, and their reading of the intercepts said that Japan's next great blow would fall on Midway, a pair of tiny islands 1,000 miles beyond Hawaii. But the intercepts named the target only by a code. The two letters, A, F. Washington doubted the interpretation. Some analysts feared the real target was Hawaii again, or even the American West Coast, and that Midway was bait. The team at Pearl Harbor proposed a trick. Midway's garrison was told to radio, in a code the Japanese were known to read, that its water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, an intercepted Japanese message reported that AF was short of fresh water. The guess was confirmed. Nimitz committed everything he had. 3 aircraft carriers, one of them so damaged from a recent battle that repair estimates ran to months. He gave the yard 3 days. Workers swarmed over the Yorktown around the clock, and she sailed with repair crews still aboard. Nimitz did not know he was right. He knew the reasoning was sound and the stakes were total, and he decided. On the morning of June 4th of 1942, American aircraft found the Japanese carrier fleet northwest of Midway. The battle that followed swung on luck as well as skill, on torpedo squadrons that were nearly wiped out but pulled the defending fighters down to sea level, and on a few minutes in which American dive bombers arrived overhead almost unopposed. By evening, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or destroyed, the core of the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. America lost the Yorktown. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, much of their experienced shipboard support structure, and more than 100 trained airmen. Losses that its narrower training system would struggle to replace as the war expanded, and with them much of its ability to dictate the tempo of the carrier war. Yamamoto's warning about running wild had been given a date: 6 months. Almost to the day. Midway did not win the Pacific War. What it did was stop the expansion. And in August, when American Marines landed on an island called Guadalcanal in the Solomons, the long, grinding counter-offensive began. 6 months of jungle, malaria, and night naval battles followed. Fighting that turned the surrounding waters into a fleet graveyard, sailors named Iron Bottom Sound. Half a world away. The second turn of the year came in the North African desert. The Desert War had swung back and forth along the coast for 2 years. And by summer of 1942, the German Afrika Korps, under Erwin Rommel, stood inside Egypt. 60 miles from Alexandria, close enough that British headquarters in Cairo burned files in what staff wits called Ash Wednesday. Beyond the Nile lay the Suez Canal and the oil of the Middle East. In late October, the rebuilt British 8th Army, under a meticulous new commander, Bernard Montgomery, attacked at El Alamein. The battle opened in darkness. Near 10 at night, on October 23rd, when more than 800 guns began firing along the whole front at once. A barrage men remembered as a single continuous wall of sound and light rolling across the desert. Behind it, infantry and engineers moved forward into minefields, the Germans called the Devil's Gardens, clearing lanes by hand, yard by yard, under fire. Montgomery had a decisive advantage in men, tanks, and above all, supply. And part of that advantage came from the country house we visited in Chapter 5, because the codebreakers at Bletchley Park were helping the Royal Navy find and sink the fuel tankers Rommel depended on. After 12 days of attrition, the Axis line broke. Churchill ordered church bells rung across Britain for the first time in the war, and later wrote that before Alamein, the Allies never had a victory, and after it they never had a defeat. It is a magnificent line, and like many magnificent lines, it flattens some history. But the emotional truth was real. Days later, American and British forces landed at the far end of North Africa, in Morocco and Algeria, the first great Anglo-American operation of the war. By May of 1943, caught between two armies, 250,000 Axis troops would surrender in Tunisia. And yet honesty about scale requires saying plainly what the deciding front was. At Alamein, Rommel commanded roughly 100,000 men. On the Russian front, that same autumn, millions were locked together, and the campaign reaching its crisis there would break the German army in a way no desert battle could. It centered on a city that bore Stalin's name. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched his second Great Eastern Offensive, aimed not at Moscow but south, toward the oil of the Caucasus, the fuel on which every future German campaign depended. Then he split the offensive, sending one army group to the oil and another to the Volga River city of Stalingrad, a decision his own generals questioned then, and historians have questioned since. What began as a move to cut a river artery became, street by street, something no longer strategic at all. Two dictators had attached their prestige to a single city, and neither would stop. The fighting inside Stalingrad has few parallels in modern war. The German Air Force bombed the city into rubble, and the rubble made a fortress. Soviet commanders ordered their men to hug the enemy, keeping front lines so close that German air power and artillery could not strike without hitting their own. Battles were fought for single buildings, floor by floor, for the grain elevator. For a hill that changed hands so many times, counts differ. For a railway station that changed hands repeatedly in a matter of days, Soviet reinforcements were ferried across the Volga at night under fire, and some newly arrived units suffered devastating losses within their first days on the West Bank. A sniper duel folklore grew from those ruins. Some of it true, much of it embellished. But the core fact needs no embellishment. By November, the Germans held most of a city that had ceased to exist, and their strength was bleeding away inside it. What they did not properly see was what was gathering on their flanks. Those flanks, along the steppe north and south of the city, were held largely by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies. Brave enough, but under-equipped, stretched thin, and short of anti-tank weapons. Soviet staff officers, planning in deep secrecy under Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, had convinced Stalin, a man who had learned something since June of 1941, to wait, husband reserves, and strike not at the city, but at the weakness beside it. On November 19th of 1942, Operation Uranus opened with an artillery barrage in freezing fog. Soviet tank armies tore through the Romanian lines north of the city, and a second blow broke through to the south. 4 days later, the pincers met at a town called Kalach, and the German Sixth Army, more than 250,000 men, was sealed inside a pocket. Goering promised his air force could supply them from the sky. It never came close. Hitler forbade a breakout, ordered the army to stand fast, and promoted its commander, Friedrich Paulus, to Field Marshal at the end, a rank from which no German officer had ever surrendered. The implication being obvious to everyone, including Paulus. Paulus surrendered anyway. On January 31st of 1943, in the basement of a ruined department store, the last pocket gave up 2 days later. Of the roughly 91,000 men who marched into Soviet captivity, starved, frostbitten, and typhus-ridden, only about 5,000 or 6,000 ever returned to Germany. Years later, in Germany, the regime declared days of national mourning, and for the first time, the radio admitted a catastrophe it could not disguise. Midway, Alamein, Stalingrad, 3 battles, 3 continents, 1 year, and they were not equal, but they pointed the same direction. The Axis tide had stopped rising. Many historians resist calling 1942 a clean turning point, and they are right that nothing was decided yet, that the U-boats were still winning in the Atlantic, that Germany still held Europe from the Pyrenees to the Volga, but something measurable had changed. From now on, the factories would speak. The American factories tooling toward full production, the Soviet factories beyond the Urals, the shipyards launching vessels faster than any enemy could sink them. And it is here, before the liberation begins, that this story must stop moving forward and turn to face what was happening behind the German lines all along. Because while the armies fought for the map, trains were running on schedule toward destinations that had no military purpose at all. Chapter 9. The Holocaust. On the morning of January 20th of 1942, 15 men arrived at a villa on the shore of a lake outside Berlin. The house at Wannsee was elegant, the setting peaceful, and the meeting short, roughly 90 minutes, including refreshments. The men were senior officials, more than half of them holding doctoral degrees, representing the ministries of Justice, Interior, and Foreign Affairs, the SS, and the administration of the occupied East. The chairman was Reinhard Heydrich. The subject, recorded in a protocol of which one copy survived the war, was the coordination of what the document called the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe. Attached was a list of countries with numbers beside them, including countries Germany did not control, such as England and Ireland. The total came to 11 million. Here is what you must understand about that meeting, because getting it right matters. Wannsee was not where the Holocaust was decided or begun. By that morning, the shooting squads we met in Chapter 6 had already murdered somewhere near 1 million people in the occupied Soviet lands. The first camp, built for killing, at Chelmno, had been operating for weeks. Wannsee was something in its own way more chilling. It was the administration catching up with the murder. The moment a modern state's bureaucracy, its lawyers and undersecretaries sat around a polished table and organized genocide as an interdepartmental project, with minutes and follow-up meetings. No one at the table objected. Several pressed for their departments to move faster. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum defines the Holocaust as the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews by the Nazi regime and its allies and collaborators. Alongside them, the regime murdered millions of others. Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, Roma and Sinti, people with disabilities killed in a so-called euthanasia program that pioneered the methods later used elsewhere, political prisoners, and other groups. Each of those histories deserves telling. This chapter follows the thread we have traced since Chapter 2, because the Jews of Europe were the center of the project, marked for total destruction. As a people, follow the thread back. Boycotts and dismissals in 1933, the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, stripping citizenship, the broken glass of November 1938, and 30,000 men taken to camps while the world's newspapers reported it on their front pages. Then war, and with Poland conquered, 2 million more Jews under German control, forced into sealed ghettos in cities like Warsaw and Lodz, where starvation and typhus killed tens of thousands before any deportation began. Then the invasion of the Soviet Union and the shooting squads, and by the autumn of 1941, the decision, whose exact dating historians still debate because no single written order from Hitler has ever been found, that the aim was no longer expulsion but death for every Jew in German Reach. The absence of that single document, incidentally, deceives no serious scholar. The chain of command speaks through 1,000 surviving orders, reports, and the testimony of the perpetrators themselves. What distinguished the Nazi project from earlier persecutions was its ambition to identify, deport, exploit, and murder an entire people across a continent, using the institutions of a modern state, the census offices and railway timetables, the police forces and finance ministries, all turned toward a single end. Its victims died by shooting, by starvation, by forced labor, by disease in the ghettos, and, beginning in late 1941 and through 1942, in killing centers built for no other purpose on occupied Polish soil. Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the vast complex at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which was both a slave labor empire and a killing center. To these places, trains ran from across the continent, from Paris and Amsterdam, from Salonika in Greece, from Hungary, from villages whose Jewish communities were centuries old. The deportees were told they were being resettled in the East. They were charged for the tickets. At Treblinka, arriving passengers saw a painted railway clock whose hands never moved. Within hours of arrival, most were dead. We will not describe the mechanics beyond what understanding requires. Out of respect for the victims, and because the survivors themselves have asked the world for comprehension, not spectacly, Treblinka alone, in about 15 months, murdered an estimated 870,000 people, with a German staff numbering only a few dozen, assisted by trained auxiliaries. That ratio is the point. This was murder organized as a process, designed so that few would have to feel themselves killers. It is the numbers that defeat the mind. So, hold instead to persons. Hold to Anne Frank, the girl from Amsterdam, whose diary, written in a hidden attic, has carried more readers into this history than any other document, and who died at 15 in Bergen-Belsen in the last weeks of the war. Hold to Janusz Korczak, the Polish doctor and beloved author of children's books, who ran an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto and refused repeated offers of personal rescue. In August of 1942, when his 200 children were ordered to the deportation trains, he went with them, and according to several later accounts, he walked at their head, calm, so that the children would be less afraid. They were taken to Treblinka, hold to the unnamed authors of the Ringelblum archive, who buried the records of the Warsaw Ghetto in milk cans and metal boxes so that the truth would survive them. 2 of the 3 caches were found after the war. 1 milk can is displayed today in Warsaw, and the memorial of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem has to date recorded the names of millions of individual victims, working still, name by name, because the murderers intended that no names remain. Did anyone resist? Yes, everywhere, in every way that circumstance allowed, and the record should end the slander that there was no resistance. In April of 1943, the young Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, armed with pistols, a few rifles, and homemade explosives, rose against the SS units sent to liquidate the ghetto, and held out among the burning buildings for nearly a month, longer than some national armies had resisted invasion. Their commander, Mordecai Anielewicz, was 23. Prisoners rose at Treblinka and at Sobibor, where an uprising in October of 1943 enabled some 300 to break out and force the closure of the camp. Partisan units of Jewish fighters operated in the forests of Eastern Europe, and resistance also meant the teacher holding secret classes in the ghetto, the rabbi and the atheist sharing bread, the thousands who kept diaries so that someone, someday, would know, and the others, the neighbors, the bystanders, the world. The honest answer is every kind of person and every kind of choice. There were countries and communities that protected their Jews. Denmark, ferrying nearly its entire Jewish population to Sweden in fishing boats in 1943. The French village of Le Chambon, hiding thousands. Diplomats like Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest and Chiune Sugihara in Lithuania, issuing life-saving papers against their own instructions. Yad Vashem has honored tens of thousands of such rescuers as righteous among the nations. There were also collaborators in every occupied country who denounced, guarded, and killed. And there were the Allied governments, who received credible reports of the extermination from 1942 onward, published a joint declaration condemning it, and yet, for reasons ranging from disbelief to wartime priorities to indifference, mounted no rescue effort remotely matching the scale of the crime. Historians continue to argue over what more was possible. That the question still burns is itself part of the legacy. By the time the war ended, about 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe had been murdered. 6 million people, among them approximately 1.5 million children. Entire worlds. The Yiddish-speaking civilization of Eastern Europe, 1,000 years in the making, had been erased in 4. The war on the map and this war behind the lines were never separate. The trains that carried deportees competed for rails with the trains supplying the Eastern Front, and the regime, to its last spring, kept choosing the deportations, understanding that choice, that the killing was not a byproduct of the war, but one of its purposes, his understanding the enemy the Allies were fighting, whether or not they fully grasped it themselves. The liberation of the camps lies ahead in our story, and with it, the moment the world's remaining doubts dissolved in front of the cameras. But first, the war had to be won, and winning it was consuming the labor, the food, and the futures of hundreds of millions of people on every continent. To them, the ones behind every front, we turn next. Chapter 10. The War Behind the Fronts. In the summer of 1941, while the German army rolled east, a Soviet official named Alexei Kosygin was handed one of the strangest assignments of the entire war. His job, as a leading member of the Evacuation Council, was to move an industrial civilization by rail, not the products of factories, the factories themselves, machine tools unbolted from their floors, furnaces, generators, entire assembly lines, loaded onto flat cars together with the workers who ran them and the families of those workers, and sent 1,000 miles east, beyond the Ural Mountains, out of the reach of German bombers. Over 1,500 large plants made the journey in a matter of months. Along rail lines, already choked with troops moving the other way, workers reassembled their machines on frozen ground, sometimes before the walls and roofs existed, and by legend and in several documented cases, tanks were coming off the lines while the buildings were still going up around them. Kosygin did not know whether the front would hold long enough for any of it to matter. He made the decision available to him, and the consequence was this. In 1942, with its richest lands occupied and millions of its people lost to the war, the Soviet Union outproduced Germany in tanks, guns, and aircraft, not slightly, by multiples. This chapter is about that hidden war, the one fought in factories, fields, kitchens, and prison barracks on every continent. Because the Second World War was decided as much by production and endurance as by generalship, and the people who carried that burden deserve more than a paragraph. Start in America, because the American transformation was the loudest. When Roosevelt announced production targets in early 1942, 60,000 aircraft in a year, then 125,000 the next. Professionals on both sides considered the numbers propaganda. American industry met or approached most of them. An automobile industry that had never built a bomber learned to build one. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, a mile-long assembly line eventually delivered 4 engine bombers at a rate approaching 1 per hour. Among the riveters on those bombers was a young widow from Kentucky named Rose Will Monroe, who had moved north with her 2 children looking for work, and who was pulled in front of the cameras for a promotional film when someone realized the plant had a real riveting Rose on the payroll. She was not the model for the famous poster, and the figure of Rosie the riveter was never one woman. It was a composite, assembled out of songs and films and advertising, and it came to stand for more than 6 million American women who entered the workforce during the war, many of them taking jobs in shipyards and aircraft plants that had been closed to them before. Shipyards, using prefabricated sections, cut the construction time of a standard cargo ship, the Liberty ship, from around 230 days to under 50 on average, and in one publicity stunt launched a complete ship in under 5 days. By the middle of the war, the United States was building more war material than all the Axis powers combined. The workforce was changing in other ways too. Over 1 million black Americans moved from the rural South into war industry cities, beginning one of the great internal migrations of American history, and finding both opportunity and, frequently, discrimination and violence, a contradiction the country would spend decades confronting. And here, American honesty requires a darker page. In February of 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and under its authority, around 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, about 2/3 of them American citizens, were removed from their homes and confined in camps in the interior for most of the war. No comparable measure was applied to Americans of German or Italian descent. Not one Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage for Japan. And the United States government formally apologized and paid reparations in 1988, calling the episode a failure of political leadership fed by race, prejudice, and war hysteria. It belongs in this story exactly as it happened. In Britain, the war reached into every pantry. Rationing covered meat, butter, sugar, eggs, clothing, and nearly everything else, administered through ration books that governed daily life into the years after the war. The country dug up parks and lawns for vegetables, took in evacuated children, and put women into factories, onto farms in the land army, and into uniformed services by the hundreds of thousands. It was drab, exhausting, and remarkably equitable. And wartime nutrition for the poorest British families was, by several studies, actually better than before the war. Because fair shares was not just a slogan but a policy. Germany ran its war economy on a different fuel: slave labor. By 1944, roughly 7 million foreign civilians and prisoners of war were working inside the German Reich. Poles and Soviet citizens deported in mass roundups. Prisoners rented out by the SS to private firms. Concentration camp inmates worked to death in underground factories. Some of the most famous names in German industry used this labor, a fact those companies spent decades reckoning with. The German home front itself was cushioned for years by plunder from occupied Europe, and civilian hardship arrived in full only when the bombing campaign and the closing fronts brought the war home. Japan's home front tightened earlier and further. An island empire dependent on shipping watched American submarines strangle its imports, and rations in Japanese cities fell year by year toward levels that left urban families hungry long before the fire raids came. School diaries and mobilization records from those years preserve a routine that would have been familiar to countless Tokyo schoolgirls. The neighborhood association meetings where attendance was recorded, the bamboo spear drills in the schoolyard, the family rice rations stretched with barley and sweet potato, and then the day the lessons stopped and the class was set to sewing army uniforms instead. School children across the country were mobilized into factories, and the state demanded ever more of a population it told ever less. In the occupied countries, the choice that defined lives was collaboration or resistance, and most people lived somewhere on the uncomfortable ground between. There were governments that collaborated, Vichy France shipping workers, and, as we saw, deporting Jews. The Norwegian puppet ruler Vidkun Quisling, whose very name became a common noun for traitor. There were resistors of every kind. French networks smuggling Allied airmen over the Pyrenees. Norwegian commandos sabotaging a plant tied to German atomic research. The Polish Home Army building a secret state with underground schools and courts. And in Yugoslavia, a full partisan war under Josip Broz Tito that tied down entire Axis divisions. Resistance was never the majority experience, and it invited savage reprisals against whole villages. Names like Orador and Lidice stand for hundreds more. But it mattered. Militarily sometimes. Morally, always. And the war behind the fronts was also an imperial war, fought with the bodies and food of people who had never been asked. India raised over 2 million volunteer soldiers, the largest volunteer army in history, while Indian political leaders demanding independence, including Gandhi and Nehru, spent much of the war in British jails. African soldiers and carriers served from Ethiopia to Burma, and in Bengal in 1943. Famine killed some 2 to 3 million people. By the estimates most historians accept, its causes are still debated. Crop failure and the loss of Burmese rice imports, wartime inflation, provincial mismanagement, and the priorities of a British government in London that repeatedly declined to divert scarce shipping for relief. A decision defenders attribute to the global shipping crisis and critics, pointing to the tone of Churchill's own recorded remarks about India. To something colder, what is not debated is that millions of British subjects starved to death inside the empire that claimed to be fighting for freedom, and that the story was censored at the time. Hold all of it together. The flat cars crossing the Urals, the widow riveting bombers in Michigan, the ration book in Liverpool, the deported laborer in Essen, the schoolgirl sewing uniforms in Tokyo, the volunteer from Punjab, the mother in Bengal. This was the true size of the war, not a map with arrows. A planet at work, under compulsion and conviction, for purposes decided far away. By the beginning of 1943, the arithmetic of all that labor was pointing one direction. The Axis powers had built their strategies around short, decisive wars, and the war had become long. What remained was to turn material advantage into liberation, mile by mile, and the year and a half that followed would show how expensive every one of those miles would be. Chapter 11. Closing the Circle. In April of 1943, Georgy Zhukov sent Stalin a report that argued, in effect, for doing nothing. German intentions that spring were obvious from the map. The winter fighting, after Stalingrad, had left a huge Soviet bulge, centered on the city of Kursk, swelling westward into the German line. Everyone could see the Germans would try to pinch it off. The question was, what to do about it? And Stalin's instinct, as always, leaned toward attacking first. Zhukov and the general staff argued the opposite. Let the Germans come. Build one of the deepest and most heavily fortified defensive systems yet constructed. Minefields, anti-tank strongpoints, trench lines echeloned back for miles. Hold the blow. Bleed the German armor white. And only then unleash the counter-offensive. It was a plan that required something the Red Army of 1941 could never have afforded, and something Stalin had rarely shown. Patience, and trust in his generals. He gave them both. Keep that word. Patience. In view through this whole chapter. For years, this war had been won by the side willing to gamble fastest. 1943 is the year the balance tipped to the side willing to prepare longest. Hitler, for his part, hesitated for months, postponing the attack to wait for new tanks. The Panthers and Tigers, his propaganda promised, would restore superiority. The delay served the defenders more than the attackers. When Operation Citadel finally opened on July 5th of 1943, the Germans attacked exactly where they were expected, into the strongest fortified zone on Earth. And the Soviets knew the hour almost precisely, opening fire on the assembly areas before the offensive even began. The battle that followed is often described as the largest clash of armor in history to that point. And around the village of Prokhorovka, it produced a legend of hundreds of tanks destroyed in a single day. A legend modern archival research has trimmed considerably, with recent scholarship showing Soviet losses there far exceeded German ones. But the tactical scoreboard misses the event. In under 2 weeks, the German offensive stalled far short of its goals. And then came the part the Germans did not expect. The Red Army's counterblows, prepared in advance through all those patient months, struck north and south of the bulge. And this time, the summer belonged to the attacker heading west. Kursk was the last great German offensive in the east, from July of 1943 to the end of the war, with local exceptions. The German army on the Eastern Front did one thing. It retreated. By November, the Soviets had crossed the Dnieper River and retaken Kiev, and the word initiative disappeared permanently from German planning in the East. The same summer, the Axis began losing a founding member. In July, American, British, and Canadian forces landed in Sicily. The first Allied return to Axis home soil. Within 2 weeks, the Fascist Grand Council in Rome, an institution that had not seriously met in years, voted against Mussolini, and the king dismissed and arrested him. The dictator of 2 decades fell without a shot fired in his defense, a lesson in how hollow the regime had become. Italy's new government negotiated in secret and announced an armistice in September, at which point the plan went wrong. German forces, anticipating exactly this, poured down the peninsula, disarmed their former allies, seized Rome, and rescued Mussolini from mountain captivity in a glider raid, installing him as head of a puppet republic in the north. For Italy, the war now became civil war layered on occupation, with Italian partisans fighting Germans and fascists in the north, while a co-belligerent Italian army fought alongside the Allies in the south. For the Allied soldiers landing at Salerno and slogging north, Italy proved a bitter teacher, and the same lesson again. There would be no quick way. The country turned out to be a defender's dream. River after river, ridge after ridge, engineered into successive German fortified lines. The names from that campaign carry their own weight. Anzio, where a bold landing behind the lines settled into a besieged beachhead for 4 months. And above all, Monte Cassino, the mountain, crowned by an abbey, founded 14 centuries earlier, where attack after attack failed through the first months of 1944. The abbey itself was destroyed by Allied bombing in February, a decision controversial then and since, because the weight of later evidence indicates German troops were not occupying the buildings until after the ruins made a better fortress. When Cassino finally fell in May, the flag raised over the rubble was Polish, planted by the Polish Second Corps, men who had traveled out of Soviet captivity through Iran to reach that hill. The soldiers who had begun this war, fighting alone in September of 1939, had kept their promise to reappear. Meanwhile, the longest battle of the war reached its verdict at sea, and it was won the same way, by accumulation rather than by genius. Through the winter of 1942 and 43, the U-boats came closer than most people ever knew to severing the Atlantic lifeline. And in March of 1943, Allied planners privately doubted the convoy system itself. Then, in a matter of weeks, the balance flipped. Escort carriers and very long-range aircraft closed the mid-ocean gap where submarines had hunted freely. Centimetric radar found surfaced boats at night. Bletchley Park read the U-boat cipher again after a blackout of months. Support groups of veteran sub-hunters reinforced threatened convoys. None of these was a miracle weapon. Together, they were decisive. In May of 1943, alone, the U-boat force lost over 40 submarines, a casualty rate no service could sustain, and its commander, Admiral Dönitz, whose own son died in one of those boats that month, withdrew the fleet from the North Atlantic. The convoys, and the invasion build-up they carried, sailed on, over Germany. The other Allied offensive of 1943 was learning its costs. The British bombed by night. The Americans, committed to precision attacks on industrial choke points, bombed by day. And in the summer, their combined raids on Hamburg created a firestorm that killed tens of thousands of civilians in a single week. A preview of what strategic bombing had become. Yet the campaign was not winning cheaply or quickly. Unescorted American daylight raids deep into Germany, against targets such as the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, suffered loss rates approaching 1 bomber in 5. Unsustainable by any arithmetic. And a low-level raid flown from North Africa against the oil refineries at Ploiesti in Romania, that August lost a comparable share of its force. By autumn, the deep, unescorted raids were suspended. What changed the air war in 1944 was not one thing, but a convergence. Drop tanks that stretched fighter range, new escort tactics under new commanders, the swelling output of American training fields and factories, and the slow strangulation of German fuel. The symbol of that change was the P-51 Mustang, an American airframe married to a British engine, a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and outfly what met it there. From early 1944, the bombers became bait as much as weapon, and the German fighter force was ground down in the sky above its own cities. An attrition that would matter enormously on a certain morning in June. Something else was accumulating in 1943. In secrecy, deeper than anything, at Bletchley. Years earlier, physicists, driven out of Europe by the regimes this story has been describing. Among them, Enrico Fermi from fascist Italy and Leo Szilard from Hungary, had persuaded Albert Einstein to sign a letter warning Roosevelt that a bomb of unprecedented power might be built from uranium, and that Germany might build it first. By 1943, that warning had grown into an industrial program spread across the United States and Canada, with secret cities rising in Tennessee and Washington state and a laboratory gathering in the New Mexico desert. It employed over 100,000 people. Almost none of them knew what they were making. Neither, at that point, did the Vice President of the United States. The direction of the visible war was set at conference tables. At Casablanca, in January of 1943, Roosevelt announced that the Allies would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. A policy praised for holding the alliance together and criticized ever since by those who argue it lengthened the war. A debate that remains open. And at Tehran in November, the three leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met together for the first time there, over Churchill's preference for further Mediterranean operations. The Western Allies committed to what Stalin had demanded since 1941, a true second front, in France. In the spring of 1944, Stalin promised in return that when it opened, the Red Army would launch a simultaneous offensive of its own, so that Germany could reinforce neither front from the other. That promise will come due in our next chapter, under a name borrowed from a general of the Napoleonic Wars. Through the first half of 1944, southern England filled with men and machines, over 1.5 million Americans among them, until the joke ran that only the barrage balloons kept the island from sinking. The plan, Operation Overlord, was commanded by an American, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a general whose genius was less for battle than for holding an alliance together. Its greatest weapon was a lie. Through double agents, phantom armies, inflatable tanks, and radio traffic from units that did not exist, Allied deception built a fictional invasion force in southeast England, opposite the narrowest crossing point at Calais. Commanded on paper by the general the Germans respected most, George S. Patton, the Germans believed it. And critically, they kept believing it, even after the real blow fell elsewhere. By the first days of June, everything waited on one variable no staff could command: the weather. And, in a house near Portsmouth, in the small hours of June 5th, with a gale lashing the windows and 5,000 ships loaded, the largest decision of the Western War sat in front of one man. Chapter 12. Europe, Liberated and Destroyed. At around 4:15 in the morning, on June 5th of 1944, in the library of a country house near Portsmouth, Dwight D. Eisenhower listened to a weather report and then sat in silence. The invasion had already been postponed once. The storm outside was proof the forecasters had been right. Now his chief meteorologist, a Scottish group captain named James Stagg, was predicting something no one could verify. A brief window of barely tolerable weather opening the next morning. June 6th. If Stagg was wrong, the greatest amphibious force ever assembled would be thrown against a fortified coast in a gale. If Eisenhower waited, tides and moonlight would not align again for 2 weeks. Secrecy might not survive. And 200,000 men, already sealed aboard ships, would have to be unloaded. The commanders around him were divided. Eisenhower paced, weighed it, and by most accounts said quietly, "Okay, let's go." It was reportedly that plane. Then the room emptied in seconds, and the machine was in motion beyond recall. That afternoon he wrote out, by hand, a short note to be released if the landings failed, taking sole responsibility, praising the troops, blaming no one. He misdated it July. He put it in his wallet and hoped never to need it. Keep that note in mind as the measure of what no one that night could know. In the darkness before dawn, airborne divisions dropped inland, scattered by cloud and fire. American paratroopers landing in flooded fields and village squares. British glider troops seizing bridges by surprise. And at first light, along 50 miles of Normandy coast, the fleet appeared. Nearly 7,000 vessels, troops from the United States, Britain, and Canada, with contingents of French, Poles, and others, headed for 5 beaches whose code names have become permanent geography. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. On 4 of the 5 beaches, the landings, though costly, went better than feared. On Omaha, everything that could go wrong did. The preliminary bombardment largely missed. Amphibious tanks foundered in the swell. The defending positions, on bluffs above the sand, were stronger and better manned than intelligence had suggested. The first waves were cut apart at the waterline, and for hours the beach was chaos. Survivors, sheltering behind obstacles, among the wounded and the dead. What turned it, by the testimony of the men who were there, was not a plan. It was small groups, sergeants and lieutenants and privates, whose officers were down, deciding separately that the only way off that beach was up, and going up. By nightfall, the Allies held every beach. The cost of the day across all forces is estimated at around 10,000 casualties, with Omaha, by far, the bloodiest of the 5 beaches. The deception kept working. For weeks, the German High Command held powerful forces at Calais, waiting for the real invasion by Patton's Phantom Army, while the actual battleground, through the Norman hedgerows, terrain that swallowed offensives, a field at a time. It took 7 weeks of attrition before American forces broke out of the beachhead at the end of July. And then the front, static for so long, dissolved into pursuit. A German counterattack ordered by Hitler against professional advice drove into a sack and was destroyed around Falaise. Paris rose against its occupiers in August. And Eisenhower, who had planned to bypass the city, sent French and American divisions in. On August 25th, the German commander of Paris surrendered, having declined to execute Hitler's order to leave the city a burning ruin. And de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées through a crowd estimated in the millions. Now the promise made at Tehran came due. On June 22nd of 1944, the 3rd anniversary of the German invasion, the Red Army opened Operation Bagration in Belarus, named for a general who had fought Napoleon. And it must be said plainly, because Western tellings so often omit it, Bagration was larger than Normandy and more destructive to the German army. In 5 weeks, Soviet forces annihilated German Army Group Center, one of the most powerful formations Germany still possessed, destroying or gutting dozens of divisions. inflicting losses of several 100,000 men. And advancing 300 miles to the Vistula River opposite Warsaw, Germany was now being crushed between two closing walls. And the eastern wall was the heavier. At the edge of that advance came one of the war's bitterest tragedies. On August 1st, the Polish Home Army rose in Warsaw, aiming to liberate the capital before the Soviets arrived. The Red Army, exhausted at the end of its supply lines by most military assessments, and by the political calculations of Stalin in the judgment of many historians, did not cross the river in force. And Stalin for weeks refused Allied aircraft the landing rights that would have allowed serious supply drops. The Germans crushed the rising over 63 days, killed perhaps 150,000 or more civilians, and then dynamited the city block by block. The debate over Soviet conduct that summer has never closed. But what Warsaw foreshadowed about the coming peace was visible even then. The autumn brought hard lessons that the war would not end by Christmas. A failed airborne carpet to the Rhine bridges at Arnhem, a bloody stalemate in the Hurtgen forest. And in December, Hitler spent his last reserves on one final gamble in the West. Through the same Ardennes forest as in 1940, the attack struck thinly, held American lines in fog that grounded Allied air power, and drove the bulge into the front that named the battle. At the crossroads town of Bastogne, surrounded American paratroopers held on, and their commander answered a German surrender demand with a single word: nuts. When the skies cleared, the offensive died. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest battle the United States Army fought in Europe, with some 600,000 Americans engaged and around 19,000 killed. And it consumed the armor and fuel Germany would need within weeks in the East. In February of 1945, the three Allied leaders met at Yalta in Crimea to shape the end, dividing Germany into occupation zones, planning the organization that would become the United Nations, and signing a declaration promising free elections in liberated Europe. Roosevelt, visibly failing, had 2 months to live. Whether Yalta was a realistic acknowledgement that the Red Army already stood where it stood, or a betrayal of Eastern Europe, is a debate that helped define the next half-century. What is certain is that the promise of free elections was not kept. That same month, British and American bombers attacked Dresden, and the firestorm killed. By the findings of a German historical commission that studied the question for years, up to 25,000 people. You may have heard figures 10 times higher. Those numbers descend from Nazi propaganda, which inflated the toll within days, and they still circulate. The real figure is terrible enough, and the debate over the raid. A city crowded with refugees, attacked late in a one war, against the argument that its rail junctions fed the Eastern Front, and that no one in February of 1945 knew the war had only weeks to run, remains one of the sharpest moral arguments of the entire air war. We give you both sides because both are real. The end came from both directions at once. American forces seized an intact Rhine bridge at Remagen in March. In the east, the Red Army fought through East Prussia and Silesia toward Berlin, and ahead of it moved one of the great migrations of suffering in European history. Millions of German civilians fleeing west in winter, a flight in which hundreds of thousands died and which was accompanied, as Soviet troops entered German lands, by mass violence against civilians, including rape on a vast scale, documented by historians on all sides and denied for decades. Telling it does not balance the ledger of who began the war and what was done in the East. It completes the account of what total war had made of Europe. And as the armies advanced from both sides, they began opening gates. The Red Army had reached the first of them in July of 1944. At Majdanek, near Lublin, taken so quickly that the killing installations were still standing. In January of 1945, Soviet troops entered Auschwitz and found several thousand prisoners too weak to have been marched away, along with warehouses holding hundreds of thousands of items of clothing and mountains of human hair. In April, the Western armies reached the camps inside Germany, Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau, and the British came to Bergen-Belsen, where typhus was killing hundreds a day among survivors. The army had no idea how to feed. Then came a decision that shaped how the world would remember all of it. On April 12th of 1945, Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf with Patton and Bradley and walked the site himself. He was, by every account of that day, not the calm alliance manager his staff knew. He ordered every unit nearby that was not in the line to be brought through the camp and see it. He cabled Washington, asking that a delegation of members of Congress and newspaper editors be flown over at once, so that they could report what they had seen with their own eyes. His stated reason, written down at the time, was that he wanted to be in a position to give first-hand evidence if there ever developed a tendency to dismiss these things as propaganda. He was right to expect the denial, and he was right about the remedy. The films and photographs made in those weeks, and the testimony of the soldiers who were there, became the evidence that no argument has ever been able to move. The doubt that had protected the world from believing its own newspapers since 1942 did not survive that April. On the same day, Eisenhower stood in Ohrdruf. Franklin D. Roosevelt died at Warm Springs in Georgia, and a former senator from Missouri named Harry Truman, vice president for 82 days, and told almost nothing, learned within hours of taking the oath that the United States was building an atomic bomb. Hold that moment. It opens our next chapter. Soviet armies encircled Berlin in the last week of April, in a bunker beneath the ruined government quarter. On April 30th of 1945, with Soviet troops a few hundred yards away, Adolf Hitler killed himself. He left behind a testament that renounced nothing, blamed the Jews for the war to the last sentence, and appointed successors to a state that no longer existed. 2 days earlier, Mussolini had been caught by Italian partisans at the shore of Lake Como and shot. On May 7th, at Eisenhower's headquarters at Reims, and again the next day in Berlin at Soviet insistence, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Crowds filled Times Square and Piccadilly and the streets of Paris. In Moscow, the guns fired salutes for a victory that had cost the Soviet Union, by the estimates now generally accepted, around 27 million dead. And in Washington, the new president accepted the celebrations and then returned to the file on his desk, because the largest war in history was still not over. Half a world away, the bloodiest island of the Pacific War was still burning. Chapter 13. The Pacific Endgame. At noon on April 25th of 1945, 13 days into his presidency, Harry Truman sat down with his Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, to be told the full truth at last. The memorandum Stimson carried began with a sentence that has few equals in the papers of any government. Within 4 months, it said, the United States would probably have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. Truman, who as a senator had once tried to investigate the mysterious spending and been waved off, now learned what $2 billion and a hidden city of workers had built. Nothing in his experience prepared him for the file, and the decisions it implied would arrive on a schedule set by physics, not politics. To understand the choices of that summer, you have to see the Pacific War as it stood, and it stood in a place darker than most Americans at home understood. The American advance had come across the ocean in 2 great prongs. MacArthur through New Guinea and back to the Philippines, where his promised return was fulfilled at Leyte in October of 1944, accompanied by the largest naval battle in history, in which the Japanese fleet was broken as a fighting force and the first organized kamikaze units appeared. The other prong, under Nimitz, drove through the island chains of the Central Pacific. And each island taught the same lesson at rising cost. Japanese garrisons did not surrender. At Saipan, where the war reached Japan's inner defense ring in 1944, thousands of Japanese civilians died, many by suicide at the cliffs, in terror of the invaders their government had promised were devils. The capture of the Marianas brought Japan's cities within range of the new B-29 bombers, and the air campaign that followed must be faced honestly. High-altitude precision bombing failed in the jet stream winds over Japan. In March of 1945, the American commander, Curtis LeMay, changed method, sending over 300 bombers at low altitude, at night, loaded with incendiaries, against Tokyo, a city built largely of wood. The firestorm of March 9th and 10th killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night. By the most commonly cited estimates, more than either atomic bomb would kill immediately, and destroyed a quarter of the city. Through the spring and summer, the fire raids burned out the hearts of more than 60 Japanese cities. This was the context of that summer. A bombing campaign already killing civilians on an enormous scale. A naval blockade starving the home islands. And no surrender. Then came Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the arithmetic that haunted every planner. On Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of volcanic rock. The Japanese garrison of some 21,000 fought from tunnels almost literally to the last man, and killed or wounded some 26,000 Americans. The flag-raising photographed on Mount Suribachi became the most famous American image of the war. 3 of the 6 men in it did not leave the island alive. Okinawa, invaded on April 1st of 1945, was worse. 12 weeks of fighting killed over 12,000 Americans, roughly 90,000 or more Japanese soldiers, and a toll of Okinawan civilians, usually estimated at over 100,000. Perhaps a quarter of the island's population. Some killed in the crossfire, some driven or ordered by Japanese forces into suicide. Offshore, kamikazes sank or damaged hundreds of ships in the largest suicide campaign in history. Every man planning the invasion of Japan, proper, scheduled for November, was looking at Okinawa and multiplying. Casualty projections for that invasion varied enormously, from tens of thousands in early staff studies to figures in the hundreds of thousands or beyond in other estimates. And the Imperial War Museums and many historians caution that some of the largest numbers grew in the telling after the war. We will not settle here what the invasion would have cost, because no one can. The people making decisions in July of 1945 did not know either. That is the honest frame for what followed. On July 16th, in the New Mexico desert at a site called Trinity, the first atomic device was tested, and the fireball turned night into a light seen 150 miles away. Word reached Truman at Potsdam. Outside conquered Berlin, where he was meeting Stalin and Churchill, and observers noticed the new president's confidence visibly stiffen. On July 26, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction. Japan's government, deadlocked and secretly hoping Moscow might broker softer terms, answered in a word, mokusatsu, whose meaning, contemptuous rejection, or withholding comment. Translators and historians have argued about ever since. On such ambiguities, the age turned. The order to use the bomb was issued on July 25th. A directive authorizing not one strike, but additional bombs as made ready. On August 6th, the bomber Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima, a city chosen in part because it had been left unburned, headquarters of an army command, and full of ordinary life. The city of Hiroshima estimates that by the end of 1945, approximately 140,000 people had died. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, exactly 3 months after victory in Europe, as promised at Yalta, and its armies rolled into Japanese-held Manchuria in an offensive that shattered the Kwantung Army within days. On August 9th, a plutonium bomb destroyed Nagasaki. A secondary target struck when cloud covered the primary, killing, on the order of 70,000 people, by year's end, by commonly cited estimates. What ended the war? Be careful with anyone who gives you one answer. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council met through those days, split 3 against 3. Even after both bombs and the Soviet attack, the army faction still demanding conditions no Allied government would accept. In the night of August 9th, in an air raid shelter beneath the palace, the deadlocked cabinet did something without precedent. It asked the emperor to decide. After years of approving or accepting the decisions that had sustained the war, Hirohito now intervened to end it, saying by the accounts of those present that he could not bear to see his people suffer further. Even then, on the night of August 14th, junior officers attempted a coup to seize the surrender recording before it could be broadcast. It failed by hours. Historians continue to weigh the bombs, the Soviet entry, the blockade, and the fire raids in Japan's decision, with serious scholars assigning the weights differently. And the moral argument over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, begun among the scientists themselves before Trinity, has never ended and should not. At noon on August 15th, the people of Japan heard their emperor's voice for the first time. In formal court language, many could barely follow, telling them the war was lost. On September 2nd of 1945, on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, under the flags of the Allied nations, the instruments of surrender were signed. MacArthur spoke briefly of a better world emerging from carnage. The Second World War was over. 6 years and a day had passed between the German troops crossing the Polish border and the signatures in Tokyo Bay. In Asia, the fighting had run longer still, and it left the world holding 2 new facts it has never put down: the knowledge of what industrial civilization could do to human beings, and the weapon that could do it in an afternoon. What the survivors built out of those facts is the final chapter of this story. Chapter 14. The World, the War Made. On November 20th of 1945, in the one great courtroom left standing in a flattened German city, a British judge called the room to order, and the leaders of a defeated state sat down in a dock to answer for what they had done. The ministers, the field marshals, the party chiefs of the Third Reich faced not a firing squad, but an indictment. The city was Nuremberg, chosen partly for its symbolism, the stage set of the regime's great rallies, partly because its palace of justice had survived the bombing. Churchill had at one point favored simply shooting the top Nazis. The Americans insisted on trial, on evidence, on a record. The chief American prosecutor, Justice Robert Jackson, opened by calling the trial one of the most significant tributes that power had ever paid to reason, and argued that the victors, flushed with victory and stung with injury, were choosing to stay the hand of vengeance and submit their enemies to the judgment of law. The trials were imperfect, and honesty says so. The judges included representatives of a Soviet state with its own vast crimes. Critics argued then and since that the tribunal was imposing a new form of individual criminal liability for acts that had never before been prosecuted in that way, while the prosecution answered that aggressive war had already been renounced by treaty between the wars, and that the novelty lay only in holding individuals answerable for it. But the trials also produced a record. The documents subpoenaed. The films entered into evidence. The perpetrators cross-examined. And that record became one of the principal documentary foundations on which our knowledge of the regime still rests, alongside the German archives, the Soviet files, and decades of later scholarship and survivor testimony. The principles announced there: that following orders is not an absolute defense, that there are crimes against humanity itself, entered international law permanently. 12 of the leading defendants were sentenced to death. A parallel tribunal sat in Tokyo, more contested in its choices. Above all, the American decision to exempt the emperor from trial in the interest of a stable occupation. A decision argued about to this day. And in courtrooms and commissions across Europe and Asia, the reckoning proceeded. Unevenly. Incompletely. For decades. The last trials of camp personnel were still being held in Germany when defendants were in their 90s. Around the courtrooms, the world was moving. Europe in 1945 contained tens of millions of displaced people, forced laborers walking home, survivors of the camps with no home to walk to, and, in the largest forced migration in European history, some 12 million or more ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe under the borders redrawn at Potsdam. The death toll of that expulsion remains disputed, and it has a long political history, with figures once claimed in the early post-war years running far above what most modern scholarship supports, which places the deaths in the hundreds of thousands. Poland itself was picked up and moved westward on the map, losing its east to the Soviet Union and gaining former German lands. And the Poland that emerged, like all of Eastern Europe, fell under Soviet-dominated governments. The free elections promised at Yalta postponed into fiction. Churchill, out of office, named the new line across the continent in a speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. An Iron Curtain. The alliance that had won the war did not survive the peace. And the two states the war had elevated above all others, the United States and the Soviet Union, settled into the armed rivalry that would organize the next 45 years. Berlin, blockaded and supplied by air in 1948. Divided, Germany hardened into two states in 1949. The same year the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, and the arms race began in earnest. The Cold War is another story, but every chapter of it was written on paper the World War had made. So was the attempt at something better. In San Francisco, in 1945, 50 nations signed the Charter of the United Nations. Its opening words promising to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. In 1948, the UN adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted under the chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt, and the same era produced the Genocide Convention, driven by a Polish-Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, who had invented the word itself after losing dozens of his family in the Holocaust. At Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, the victors had already designed the economic order, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, a system built around the American dollar, out of the conviction that the Depression's economic collapse had fed the catastrophe. And in Western Europe, American aid under the Marshall Plan helped rebuild the ruins on the theory, radical, after 1919, that a prosperous former enemy was safer than a punished one. West Germany and Japan, occupied and remade, became within a generation two of the most stable democracies and largest economies on earth. Whatever else the post-war settlement got wrong, that reversal of the Versailles logic is the clearest lesson the peacemakers learned from the story we began with. Consider the position of the soldiers of the Polish Second Corps. The men who took Monte Cassino when the fighting stopped. The country they had fought for since 1939 now lay inside the Soviet sphere, ruled by a government that regarded men like them with suspicion. And for many of them, the hometown they had left, in the east, was no longer in Poland at all. Thousands never went back. They settled in Britain, in Canada, in Australia. Heroes of a victory that had somehow lost them their country. Their situation is a reminder that for millions of people, the war did not end in 1945. It simply changed shape. In the lands of the survivors of the Holocaust, the war's end brought no simple homecoming either. Many returned to find their houses occupied and their welcome cold. And in 1948, 3 years after the camps, the State of Israel was declared in part of British-ruled Palestine, admitting hundreds of thousands of survivors and displaced Jews. And war followed immediately with its Arab neighbors, in which hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled or were driven from their homes. The consequences of those years remain on the front pages today, and this story only notes where they began. And the war broke the empires. This is the consequence Western tellings most often leave out, and it may be the largest of all. The European colonial powers had been defeated, occupied, or exhausted, and their subjects had watched. Asian populations had seen European armies surrender at Singapore and Manila. Millions of Indians, Africans, and Southeast Asians had fought, produced, and starved for a freedom their rulers did not intend to extend to them. Within 2 years of the surrender on the Missouri, India and Pakistan were independent. Within a decade, from Indonesia to Ghana, the wave was unstoppable, sometimes negotiated, sometimes through wars in Vietnam and Algeria, whose roots ran straight back to 1945. The war accelerated the collapse of European imperial rule and made its restoration increasingly impossible to defend. In 1945, the map of the world showed a handful of empires. 25 years later, the international system contained well over 100 sovereign states, a great many of them newly independent. Count the cost. As best it can be counted, the war killed more than 60 million people, with serious estimates ranging to 80 million or beyond, depending on what is counted. Famine, disease, the missing. The Soviet Union lost around 27 million. China's dead are estimated from 10 million to 20 million. Numbers so uncertain because the counting itself was a casualty. Poland lost roughly 1 in 6 of its pre-war population. 6 million Jews. More than 400,000 Americans. Nearly all of them soldiers. A nation uniquely spared at home and transformed all the same. Now go back, one last time, to the 2 men in the Hall of Mirrors. Hermann Müller and Johannes Bell signed a peace they hated because they believed refusing meant something worse. And they could not know that the document would be turned into one of the myths that extremists used to explain every humiliation and excuse every ambition that followed. Chamberlain boarded his airplane, believing he was preventing the last war from happening again. Stalin filed the warnings of invasion under provocation. The ministers in London pounded the table and chose to fight on when arithmetic said otherwise. Nimitz trusted a message about a broken water plant. Eisenhower stood in a camp in Thuringia and understood that the proof would have to be gathered now. Because the denial was coming, a president 13 days into the job opened a file about a weapon he had never been told existed. None of them knew the ending. All of them chose anyway. Inside the fog, with the information and the fears they had. That is what this story asks you to carry out of it. History does not happen to people. It is made of their decisions. The catastrophic ones and the redeeming ones, made one at a time by men and women who could not see forward, but whose choices we can now see all the way through. The world you live in, its borders and institutions, its warnings and its debts, is the sum of what they decided. They could not know how the story ends. You do. The question the Second World War leaves behind is not what we would have done in their place. It is what we are deciding now, in the fog of our own moment, that someone 80 years from now will see with terrible clarity. That story is yours.